And I think for us also tonight at PsySSA, it's really an honor and pleasure. Welcome, Juan, and to also teach us more about all the wisdoms and knowledges that he has. So thank you, Juan, for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Chris. One correction. Anyone who knows Chris will know that Chris is the slave driver, and I have to be at the beck and call. So, and I'm sure I don't have to overemphasize that enough, because I'm sure you know Chris. Okay. Is this my cue to start the presentation?
Yes, go for it. With that off tonight, Elma.
Juan, please go for it.
Sure. And can I just check before I do, is the presentation meant to be 45 minutes or an hour?
If you can talk in 45, that would be great.
Okay, that's what I've aimed for.
We're not going to stop you.
Okay, I can talk forever, so I'm going to try and stick to 45 minutes.
Thank you.
Having said that, of course, the slide with the title of the presentation has been on the screen for a while. And essentially, it is about a tool towards greater ethical and gender-affirming healthcare practices that I'm going to be presenting. And it's in particular the PsySSA practice guidelines. One other thing that I'm wanting to say about this slide is that as much as I am employed by UNISA, this presentation is under the auspices of the Psychological Society of South Africa and the Sexuality and Gender Division, because it's in that context that that work was done. Another thing that I'm wanting to flag from the outset is that PsySSA approached me to do a previous presentation, and that was on the 29th of November, 2020. The presentation is available on YouTube, and I'm flagging that in particular because what I presented there really is a precursor for today's presentation, but the time will just simply not allow me to repeat what I said in that context. So although there is overlap, today's presentation certainly excludes aspects such as an overview of the history of depathologization, of diversity of sexual and gender identity. And then also it excludes ways that we celebrate diversity also in psychological practice and mental health service provision more broadly, with the knowledge that a pathology or deficit frame remains or is still very explicit in the minds of many service providers, as much as users, clients, and patients. Another thing that I'm not presenting today that I presented then was an overview of the development process of the guidelines, as well as the team that presented it, and I refer to that team as the Flaming Faggots for very specific reasons. I showed a video on the launch of the guidelines in 2018 that was, and then indeed I reflected a little bit in that presentation about how we know that our work has impact. So if you weren't part of that presentation and you are interested, then of course feel free to visit the PsySSA website, where I'm sure this YouTube videos is available. So my presentation today is then indeed informed by the title of the presentation. I'm going to start with who and what is PsySSA, what are the practice guidelines, what is an affirmative stance and or affirmative practice, the need for and purpose of the guidelines, how to engage with the guidelines document. And I'm giving you a link to the actual guidelines document, so feel free to take it from this slide or take a photo and then call up the the guidelines, because the next point of the presentation is indeed going to visit those 12 guidelines as tool towards greater ethical and gender affirming healthcare practices before I then conclude. Those of you who were in the previous presentation will see familiar bullets in this slide. And certainly what I did in that previous presentation was really just reflect on 3 of the guidelines and ever so briefly. So let's look at who or what is PsySSA. And there's again a link to the PsySSA Constitution. And I encourage, if you're interested at all in what PsySSA stands for, to visit this constitution. And I must say, truly a very progressive constitution, decidedly committed to human rights and in addressing the historic silences in psychology, as well as transformation. And those were some of the words I took in particular from the Constitution to guide how we got the society to buy into the work that we were wanting to do. Certainly, what is important about PsySSA is that it's the nationally representative, not the only, but indeed the largest professional association for psychology professionals in South Africa. And indeed, it's a learned society as per the International Science Council of South Africa. And again, I'm giving you a web link that you can visit if at all it's of interest to you to understand what a learned society is about. The way that I understand a learned society is that it indeed speaks to a commitment to the advancement of the science and or scholarship, or otherwise research-informed psychological practice. And indeed, there are a lot of learned societies internationally. In South Africa, there are a few. Because of our status in the international arena, we indeed also represent South Africa on the International Union of Psychological Science. And PsySSA was very instrumental in the launch of the Pan-African Psychology Union. I'm going to specifically flag the fact that there's a second Congress of PAPU in 2022, and that's in March 2022, which might present an opportunity, if not for PsySSA, then certainly for the SGD, the Sexuality and Gender Division, perhaps in association with PsySSA, to advance some of our work on the continent, because that's what PAPU is indeed about. It is about developing stronger focus for the role of psychology within South Africa, and it's the related scholarship and human development that features very much. I'm not going to talk much about the structures of PsySSA, other than to say that the AGM is the highest decision-making body, but standing committees and one division in particular played a pivotal role in getting the guidelines that I'm presenting today approved. And that was the Ethics Committee, as well as the Committee on Transformation, Equity and Transformation. And then the division is the Sexuality and Gender Division. And our representation on the International Psychology Network for LGBTI issues, ISINET, was pivotal in moving us forward to not only launch a project team, the African LGBTI Human Rights Project, where Chris, myself, Santosh Pillay, Neil Victor, Deleen van Dijk, and indeed, more recently, Sakile has joined that project team as well. So all of these structures are important for you to just take note of in terms of that PsySSA is truly reputable and internationally recognized, and that when we have guidelines of this nature, indeed, it grabs the attention of the international community, which it did in this instance as well. This slide I previously presented, and it is about ISINET. And in ISINET's context, I just want to refer again to the 2018 affirmative statement of LGBTIQ+ concerns, signed by 30+ national psychology associations. And I will refer to the website for ISINET at the end of the presentation. And look at that. It's truly phenomenal work that's happening in psychology towards promoting affirmative practice. I want to flag that the APA, the American Psychological Association, not only hosts ISINET, but indeed are pioneers in the field of affirmative practice. And then PsySSA's involvement in this project and the objectives, in particular, what is important is the development of the affirmative practice guidelines. That, of course, is the what this presentation is about. So this is a new slide. It wasn't included in my previous presentation of November last year. And I thought it might be in particular of importance to PsySSA as you also consider trans and gender diverse specific guidelines, which I understand is the case. And I thought it might be useful for you to know that in our understanding, practice guidelines need to be distinguished from a position statement, needs to be distinguished from treatment guidelines, and needs to be distinguished from statutes. With a position statement really in the broad outlining of organization's official stance in the matter. So of course it can be used in statements that the organization make and the rest. Treatment guidelines, which I was wondering whether it might not be a little bit at play in what PsySSA might indeed be intending, has more of a client-focused intention, and it addresses intervention-specific recommendations for a population, so a target group. Here I referred to clinical population, or condition, and we know that those terminologies might have a pathology framing, which is indeed not the intention, but it's a definition I took from other work. And then statutes are legally enforceable with sanctions and penalties, which of course guidelines are not. So they're aspirational in nature, and they provide a guide and a reference for professionals, and in this instance, of course, psychology professionals, to deal more sensitively and effectively with a specific subject matter. And indeed, it recommends certain things, and it provides applied tools to develop a basic level of competency. It's a general framework with broad application across scopes of practice and categories. And in psychology, what I say in this regard is quite important. But then also it is informed by current research and in-depth understandings globally and in particular locally. So perhaps the definition of practice guidelines that might guide you in your work. I did present what assuming an affirmative stance or what affirmative practice might mean, but because I understand that not everyone in this meeting were in that previous meeting, it might be important to just highlight that in our understanding, assuming affirmative stance is not a given. It's not something that we can assume is in place. It can be cultivated. It's an ongoing sensitivity, and it is about acceptance of sexual and gender diversity. It distinguishes clearly between what might historically been viewed as abnormal, and indeed rather refers to that sexual and gender diversity as part of the diverse human spectrum or human condition. So indeed, what we emphasize in taking an affirmative stance is that you have to have contextual awareness of prejudice that is so embedded in our society and institutionally and otherwise. And that indeed, when we think about homo, bi, and transphobia and the impact on the well-being of people, it is truly important to make sense of not only those overt prejudices, but also the many barriers within society and in relation to significant others. It's indeed about having empathy with the unique experiences of the sexually and gender diverse, as well as knowledge of their diversity. It's about holding a positive view of clients and their lives, and indeed recognizing that there's resilience and resourcefulness and creativity rather than just vulnerabilities and victimhood, so to speak. And the last point that's really important around affirmative stance is to say, check your own blind spots when working with the sexually and gender diverse, because of course it might, if you're not comfortable with your own sexuality and gender, it might present another barrier. So why the needs for the guidelines? And indeed, the need for the guidelines were most clearly articulated in our 2013 PsySSA position statement, and you'll remember the definition I gave of what a position statement is. We produced that way back in 2013, and that guided the guidelines development process. And certainly we felt that psychological services may be the last safe space that sexually and gender diverse people seek out. away from persistent prejudice, violence, and hate victimization that so regularly occurs in our society. And then, of course, by extraction, mental health care provision, not just psychological services are at play here, but that the heterosis normativity that is so prevalent also affects access to and quality of service provision. So the discrimination and negative encounters with healthcare providers is too often a reality for us to ignore. And with that in mind, of course, it speaks to the fact that there's often a lack of training in this field, and that there's indeed ignorance in terms of how to deal with LGBTIQA+ people, or then the sexually and gender diverse. So a clear need for why the guidelines that are quite generic, as you'll see from our presentation later, where your guidelines or then treatment protocols that you might be developing could indeed be much more targeted. So the purpose of the guidelines, it is indeed to convey this affirmative stance. It's certainly emphasizing the need for local guidelines versus adopting the international guidelines that exist through the APA, the BPS, which is in Britain. Australia has guidelines, New Zealand have guidelines that are very similar to the South African ones and quite interestingly different as well, with quite a lot of indigenization. And increasingly other countries are picking up on developing these guidelines, but we needed local guidelines. And indeed, when we developed these guidelines, they were primarily for psychology professionals in South Africa. But from the outset, we had a clear sense that there might be applicability to mental health professionals more broadly and then beyond South Africa. The guidelines are consistent with our Constitution and Bill of Rights, and I'll return to that point. It's indeed also consistent with the South African Health Professions Act and the general ethical rules for health professionals and the PsySSA Constitution that I referred to earlier. And it certainly is towards supplementing a harm avoidance approach. So if we talk about the ethics implied, of course, it speaks to it. So again, I'm flagging the web link for the guidelines document because I'm getting closer to moving into the actual guidelines. And in this regard, it's really important to note that each section in the guidelines document is a standalone and were actually written by different authors. So the voice is not consistent throughout, and we left it in that manner quite intentionally to reflect the diverse constellation of the core team that developed the guidelines, but also the different voices in this field. So it's important to cross-reference these guidelines, and our recommendation really is scan read the whole document before focusing in on the section that is most relevant to your specific case, concern, inquiry, and the likes. There's a very useful glossary at the back of the document, and indeed there are also appendixes that you'll find of interest. So 84-page document that I truly think conveys a lot. And I might mention to you that, of course, with the document being drafted over several years, 2013 essentially through to 2017, you can imagine that quite a lot has already changed in the field. So when you engage with the document, be kind with the understanding that, of course, as I've often heard Chris put a footnote in, things can change almost in an hourly fashion in this field. So we are aware that indeed we're moving to a point of having to update this document very soon. The next slide just really refers to that each guideline has a rationale and then an application. The rationale speaks to the need for the guideline and then provides some supporting data from research and professional consensus. And then the application is about suggestions for practice use, and then some demonstrations and anecdotal examples. So elements to note in the guidelines document, and for those who were in the previous presentation, this is also a new slide. And there's a little bit of overlap of what will follow in my next slide, but it's really just to help you with making sense of what is potentially quite an overwhelming and dense 12 guidelines that I'll be engaging with. You'll see elements of human rights and self-determination. You'll see a clear emphasis on diversity and fluidity. You'll see that we highlight the challenges faced by the sexually and gender diverse population, the implications of intersectionality to our work, the impact of stigma, prejudice, and discrimination also on mental health and well-being, that there's multiple and fluid developmental pathways at play, complexities of relationships within the sexual and gender diverse contexts, and then clearly a very affirmative stance following best practice care, continuing professional development, and the promotion of social awareness. So with this snapshot, if you grasp this, you'll understand the spirit of the document quite clearly. And these 12 namings for the guidelines will give you a key to understanding what each of the guidelines essentially would be about. And it covers what I presented now, but of course just gives you clarity of where to find what. And this summary does occur in the actual guidelines document. So you'll find it there at the beginning of the document. So guideline 1 is about non-discrimination, unsurprisingly. Guideline 2, individual self-determination. And again, I would want to say quite evident that it will be at the outset. Guideline 3, it's about enhancing professional understanding. 4, awareness of normative social contexts. 5, intersecting discriminations. 6, counteracting stigma and violence. 7, recognizing multiple developmental pathways. 8, non-conforming family structures and relationships. 9, the necessity of an affirmative stance. 10, foregrounding global best practice care. 11, disclosing and rectifying of personal biases. And then the final one, an emphasis on continuing professional development. Before I proceed and then indeed go into each of these individual guidelines, I'm quite convinced that you might already feel quite overwhelmed with what might be a mouthful, but I hasten to say that I'm sure you'll agree with me that none of these themes would be irrelevant to your own constituency as PsySSA. And that you'll indeed find lots of relevance. I also want to flag that guideline 9, so the necessity of affirmative stance. 11, disclosing and rectifying personal biases. And then 12, continuing professional development. I will not be going into detail in, and that's in the interest of time, and with an understanding that I've about 40 minutes or so left, and I know how much time flies when you're having fun. So let's start then with what these guidelines entail. The preface to the guidelines essentially says, recognizing the harm that has been done in the past to individuals and groups by prejudice against sexual and gender diversity in South Africa, as well as psychology. PsySSA hereby affirms the following. And then, of course, before you read each of the guidelines, you insert the psychology professionals, respect, and this is guideline 1, respect human rights of sexually and gender diverse people, and are committed to non-discrimination on the basis of sexuality and gender and biological variance. And I can perhaps already flag to you that we have since decided that biological variance will be referred to as biological diversity going forward. And I think for reasons that might be apparent to you. there's a bit of a summary of what this guideline entails, but I'm now going to the actual guideline in the document, and it's on page 14 and a few that follow on that. So if you are able to call up the guideline document and you want to read with me, then of course feel free to do so. And I'm really going to do it quite verbatim because I can't formulate it better than what it appears in this document. But other than the South African Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and then the National Action Plan for the protection and promotion of human rights, I want to emphasize that the African Commission of Human and People's Rights had something very interesting to say in its 55th ordinary session that was held in May 2014, and it passed a specific resolution that I do think speaks a lot to our work, and that you might want to in particular go and read what that ACHPR resolution is about. But in the context that could be construed as broadly applying to health care practitioners, the resolution also calls on state parties to ensure that human rights defenders work in an enabling environment that is free of stigma, reprisals, or criminal prosecutions as a result of their human rights protection activities, including the rights of sexual minorities, and of course, sexual and gender minorities, I would want to say. But you'll see that specifically gender diversity is mentioned in this context as well. And it does speak to what has happened in Nigeria and Uganda in particular, where we know that healthcare professionals who've provided services to the sexually and gender diverse were open to prosecution as well. So in upholding human rights in our work, of particular relevance, of course, would be the sexual rights as articulated in the international context. And I'm not going to read through them now, but I want to ask that you engage again around what those sexual rights entails. And I imagine if those sexual rights that go back to 2014, well, initially 2008 and then 2014, if they were to be articulated again, and perhaps they have since been renamed, I imagine the gender aspect would feature much more in the naming convention as well. I'm going to read just, I think it's 2 applications that follow from this guideline that speak specifically to your constituents. So all registered psychology professionals in South Africa, and this is on page 15, are legally and ethically bound to uphold the human rights of the people with whom they work. So, as outlined in Guideline 12, CPD also requires a minimal level of ethical training on an ongoing basis. There are at least 3 levels where the human and sexual rights of service users, clients, and participants need to be upheld and respected by psychology professionals. It's at the personal or individual level, at the institutional environment, the place where you and or your work may be situated, and then within the larger contextual system that could be community, society, country, globally within which you operate. Now I read that because there's one application that specifically says the following: in society more broadly, exploring ways to advocate for human and sexual rights in general, as outlined in international contexts, might include supporting trans and gender diverse service users, among others, in accessing legal recognition to alter their sex description on their ID. The professional service provider might be engaged in various steps of the process, for example, writing a support letter that could be provided to the Department of Home Affairs by the transgender person. Secondly, approaching their medical aid and or health insurer, if they are in this position, to apply or appeal for certain health-related services that could be supported by medical aids in South Africa. And then thirdly, raising awareness of avenues to report breaches of human rights and discriminatory practices in order to advise service providers, clients and participants accordingly. So you can see a very clear application to your constituency. I'm going to move to the second one. So again, psychology professionals subscribe to the notion of individual self-determination, including having the choice of self-disclosure. Now, in the actual guideline on page 18, the name for this guideline is a little bit more elaborate. I'm going to stick with what's on the slide in the interest of time. And I'm going to read quite a few paragraphs of this guideline because I do think it has particular relevance, and where the human rights framework might be more self-evident, it could be of interest for you to make sense of how this fits with your needs. So under the rationale, the South African professional conduct guidelines in psychology encourage psychology professionals to respect the right to self-determination of service users, clients, participants, and patients. This entails a process by which a person controls or determines the course of their own life. Self-determination includes the ability to seek treatment, consent to treatment, or refuse treatment. The informed consent process is one of the ways by which self-determination is maximized in psychotherapy. Affirmative psychological support may be beneficial in the identity development and decision-making of transgender and gender non-conforming individuals regarding their social and medical transition, closely aligned to some of the principles highlighted in Guideline 10, which is foregrounding global best practice care. This affirmative and transition-related healthcare support should be offered irrespective of whether the person has a binary or non-binary gender identity, and whether they seek access to social or medical transition, or one, several, or all treatments available. In prioritizing and privileging individual self-determination, it may serve psychology professionals well to remember that in accordance with the standards of care for the health of transgender and gender non-conforming individuals, and you'll recognize that as WPATH 2011, these individuals have the right to define their identities, live according to their gender identity, as well as to decide on and to access medical, psychotherapeutic, and social support as needed. The full autonomy of transgender and gender non-conforming individuals in affirming their health, their gender identities ought to be supported. And then I'm going to read two more before looking at application. Trans people should be supported to make informed decisions about their bodies and gender expression without the gatekeeping of healthcare practitioners. And then an example is provided of a consent form that indeed outlines risks associated with hormone treatment towards enabling informed decisions. And that's one of the appendixes that might be useful for you to consult. And then there's a last point around the rationale that I'm going to quickly highlight for you as well. Case in point is whether it can be expected of sexual and gender diversity, affirming therapists or counselors to embrace a specific client patient's initial treatment goal, calling for gender identity or sexual orientation change efforts, knowing that internalized stigma and heterosis-normativity may indeed be at play. Accordingly, self-determination should rather be viewed together with other ethical principles, such as the provision of services that are likely to provide benefit and avoidance of services that are not effective or have the potential for harm. And then under application, I'm going to read 2 points. The one is psychology professionals respect the right of service users, clients, participants. And just to perhaps insert at this point, before I continue reading, you'll see that we were very intentional in a broad naming of who might be our target grouping. So a service user, client, participant, research participant, even for that matter, features in all of our naming. I might skip a little bit of that just to save on time, but it's very intentional because we wanted to make clear that our practice guidelines extend beyond psychotherapy and indeed to the other domains within psychological practice. So with my interruption, I'm going to return to starting at the beginning. Psychology professionals respect the right of the service user to be called by the name of their choice and relevant pronouns and accept individual choices as to the extent to which they wish to transition, i.e. in the case of a transgender person, either or, both hormones and surgery. And another one, coming out should be a decision that the service user make for themselves, taking into consideration the context of the individual situation. For instance, with regard to trans disclosure, individuals should be able to live stealth if they want to. And then there's a complete definition of stealth being provided in the guidelines, which I'm not going to read, assuming that you're familiar with that term. I'm going to move to the next guideline, and that's enhancing professional understanding. And I see that I have about 10, 15 minutes left, so I'm quickly running out of time. So with the next guideline, enhancing professional understanding, psychology professionals acknowledge and understand sexual and gender diversity and fluidity, including biological variance or diversity then. And the rationale for this guideline speaks to, for both psychology professionals and individuals seeking assistance, the language and concepts of sex, gender identity, and orientation can be complex and confusing. The consequence of imprecision of language, lack of understanding, and misunderstanding may be profound, particularly in terms of reduced sense of agency and options for service users. The real-life experiences of individuals often do not conform to the academic categorizations that professionals use, and this might cause additional challenges. I'm going to read two more in this regard, and then most probably jump to the next guideline, that is. Professionals need to recognize how profoundly sex and gender are conflated in popular discourse. In reality, what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man or neither differ among societies and change over time, even within societies. But many social forces and socializing agents in society make people believe that there are only two gender categories, and that indeed these gender categories, i.e. men and women, have fixed meanings which are natural, eternally enduring, and universal. An affirmative stance challenges these myths. Some persons' identity issues are not necessarily linear, moving in a forward direction to an endpoint or on an inevitable journey from A to B. Trans persons, for instance, may seek to reverse certain processes or may arrive at a different understanding of who they are now as they age. And then the last aspect that I'm going to highlight under the rationale for this guideline, psychology professionals should engage service providers, understand that although concepts of biological sex, sexuality, and gender are interrelated, are not necessarily dependent on each other. Towards enhanced professional understanding, these concepts need to be analyzed and evaluated, and then the guideline does that extensively. Before looking at application, and under the application, I'm going to indeed mention just a few because it might be useful for you. I'm going to go to the one that says, being aware that some medical interventions at time required in intersex and transgender affirming care, such as hormonal treatment, may affect emotional states and appropriate coping strategies for new emotional experiences. And another one, assisting people to differentiate between gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexual behavior, also understanding that these might be intertwined, yet separate journeys for the person. For example, a transgender man could have any sexual orientation, or a lesbian might have sex with a man and still identify as lesbian. So there is perhaps this one is important for me to also then read. So it's on page 27 for those who are following. The way the psychology professional uses sexual and gender diversity language should encourage acceptance. Psychology professionals are encouraged to consider carefully the use of language in all areas of practice. To do this, they should be mindful that the terms which the individual chooses to use to describe themselves might not be academically or ethically acknowledged. Allow for self-identification and self-labeling. Inquire which pronoun the client prefers. Inquire which titles are preferred. Ensure that the ways in which questions are phrased and how they respond should be inclusive rather than occlusive in the ways people express themselves. And then there's a few others. I'm going to move to awareness of normative social context. And perhaps because I imagine this might be quite familiar to the audience tonight, I'm going to not focus so much on this with the clock ticking. So the rationale, of course, for psychology professionals are aware of challenges faced by sexually and gender diverse people in negotiating heteronormative, homonormative, and cisnormative contexts, includes reference to, among others, related assumptions and the implications also for healthcare provision of cisnormativity and heterosexual and cisgender privilege. And this is then also illustrated through application that, forgive me, but I'm going to skip in the interest of time. I'm also going to be rather brief around the next guideline, which is guideline number 5, which speaks to psychology professionals are sensitized to the impact of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. And again, I'm merely going to read what's on the screen for you as well. So it includes the definition of intersectionality, which is, of course, really paramount in our work nowadays in this field. And the application is made to practitioner awareness of the multiple intersecting identities of sexually and gender diverse individuals, practitioner awareness of the diversity of experiences among sexually and gender diverse individuals, and the importance of a use of cultural humility as a tool when working with cultures different from your own. So it's really actually saying it's not a one size fits all, and we can't generalize in terms of the experience of a trans or gender diverse person who lives in Sandton, has a good education, and for that matter, the person in rural KZN without education that indeed faces a lot of discrimination and victimization. This does feed into, for me, a very important guideline, and a guideline that I'm particularly very familiar with because it speaks so directly to the work that I do. But I do, again, imagine that it's relatively familiar to you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to really also stick to what you have on the slide as well. So psychology professionals have an understanding of stigma, prejudice, discrimination and violence, and the potential detrimental impact of these factors on mental health and well-being. And then you'll see what this guideline includes would be a reference to the body of knowledge in respect of the significant experiences of and fear of discrimination, victimization, and ill treatment, as well as institutional discrimination and oppression. And what I want to raise in this regard is that it's one thing to have a experience of discrimination, victimization, or ill treatment, but the fear of such experiences has been shown in research internationally, but also in South Africa, to sometimes even have more severe implications for someone, and that might just be important for you to take note of. But then this work is also applied to awareness that all sexually and gender diverse people, regardless of race and or socioeconomic status or culture, may have been subjected to systemic prejudice, discrimination, and violence, albeit in varying forms and at different levels of intensity. And of course, it also speaks to intersectionality, which was the previous guideline. Practitioners are then also encouraged to recognize the nature and extent of bullying, hate speech, and hate crime sexually and gender diverse people endure. Practitioners ought to recognize and counteract the psychological effect of stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and violence on the individual and targeted group or community. And then indeed, practitioners should remain cognizant of the effect of stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and violence on society in general. The point here is that the effects, the negative impact, the detrimental impact of stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and violence extends beyond the individual, indeed, to the targeted community and society more broadly. And that is an important way to motivate the work that we might be doing. I am going to start moving towards conclusion in this regard with me seeing that my clock is indicating that I'm close on 45 minutes. So I'm going to read what the next guidelines entail. And I must say, perhaps some of the most interesting ones I'm going to have to skip over. So 7 speaks to recognizing the multiple and fluid sexual and gender developmental pathways of all people through life, and indeed includes reference to a general movement away from imposed identities to self-chosen identities, an increased recognition of personal agency, human development variations and attractions, and identities that evolve over a lifetime, cultural and social contexts that change over time, including expectations of people at different stages of life, and the needs of people that may differ across their lifespan. That's really forcing us to not have a linear or fixed understanding of these things, but indeed a deconstructed and, well, I suppose listening to the lived experiences of people that we work with. The next guideline, indeed, is about the understanding the diversity and complexities of relationships, including the potential challenges of sexually and gender diverse parents and their children, the challenges within families of origins and families of choice in coming to terms, and for people in different relationship configurations, including polyamorous relationships. And I must say, in this regard, it's in particular the first bullet point and the second that might have direct and immediate relevance to your constituency. And it includes things like acknowledgement that many of the people well, that either we are or that we work with are parents, sometimes before coming out as sexually and gender diverse, or want to have children, either through their own means, via adoption, fostering, surrogacy, and that includes lesbian and gender non-conforming people, and for that matter, trans men, and that there might be specific reproductive treatment concerns to consider. I was in any case only planning to read guideline 9 rather than go into details. So it's adherence to affirmative stance in policy development and planning, research and publication, training and education, intervention design and implementation. With this one, supporting best practice care. I hope that many of you are aware of the work of the WPATH, and I specifically referred to that in the absence of South African specific best practice standards of care. And of course, I'm acutely aware that PsySSA has every intention to correct reliance on international guidelines and to have something that's much more, I suppose, contextualized, with decoloniality in mind and indeed relevant to our context. So I'm not going to say anything more about that other than that you, of course, in the best hands when it comes to this. And then in the interest of time, really knowing that guideline 11 is about blind spots and disclosing these, and indeed referral where necessary. And guideline 12 is about continuing professional development, something that I know PsySSA is very invested in, as is the Sexuality and Gender Division of PsySSA. So I'm going to move towards conclusion. And in the conclusion, I'm going to do 2 things only. I'm going to draw attention to a related PsySSA training initiative, and I'm going to mention some important contact details And of course, it is a little bit of an attempt as well of flagging the work of the Sexuality and Gender Division that, of course, has to be credited, well, and PsySSA, that has to be credited for what we consider very progressive work in this field. So PsySSA has shown its commitment to this field by furthering developing guidelines-related curriculum. And indeed, Chris, myself, and the rest of our team have already trained 500 plus social workers in Gauteng to date in this workshop, which was initially a 3-day workshop. It's become a 4-day workshop, and it's much more effective as a 4-day workshop. It's very experiential and sensitization training, adult-based training in its focus. It builds very much on self-awareness, and of course, it's about competence development. You'll find the flyer for this workshop downloadable from the SGD website, or web page rather, on the PsySSA website. And indeed, you'll see a Facebook and Twitter account that is listed on this flyer as well. So please, if at all you're interested, know someone who is interested. We are planning for the Western Cape, in any case, running this workshop because there's been a specific interest from the Western Cape. Bear that in mind and be in contact with Chris or myself if that is indeed the case. I'm sure because of so many of you being located in KZN, who knows, we might do something like this in KZN in the foreseeable future as well. We've got a flyer of the Sexuality and Gender Division that's also available on our website, and you'll see ISINet's web address towards the right at the bottom of this slide, and you'll see my contact details, you'll see the PsySSA website, and without further ado, this concludes my presentation.